Robert "Thunder" Johnson asked a black janitor to fight him for fun. What happened next silenced the entire boxing gym. "Hey, you cleaning up in there? How about a quick demonstration?" Robert Johnson shouted from the center of the ring, his training gloves glistening under the fluorescent lights of the elite boxing academy in Chicago. "I bet you've never seen a real fight in your life, right?" David Washington stopped cleaning the floor and slowly looked up. At 42, he had become virtually invisible in the hallways of the city's most prestigious boxing gym. As a night cleaner, his presence was tolerated but rarely acknowledged by the boxers who dominated the environment during prime training hours. David had been working at that gym for only 3 weeks, always arriving after the boxers had left. But on that Thursday night, the advanced classes had run past their usual time. What no one knew was that David always arrived 2 hours earlier than necessary. Not because of excessive dedication to his cleaning job, but because it was the only time he could watch the training sessions without being disturbed. Sitting discreetly in the back row, he watched every move, analyzed every technique, mentally correcting mistakes he saw in the younger fighters. During those 3 months, David had become a silent observer of the world that was once his home. He knew the names of all the coaches, knew which fighters had real potential and which were just playing at being boxers. He could predict with frightening accuracy who would win each sparring match just by watching the initial stance. But no one knew who David really was. To them, he was just another cleaning employee, someone whose presence was necessary but completely ignorable. "I don't want to bother you, champ," David replied calmly, returning to scrubbing a stubborn stain on the floor. "Just finishing up here so you can get back to training." His voice carried a respectful politeness that contrasted sharply with the arrogance that filled the air around him. Robert let out a loud theatrical laugh that echoed through the gym like a lion roaring to mark its territory. "Everyone, look at this. The guy's afraid to even step in the ring." The 8 boxers present laughed nervously, some clearly uncomfortable with the situation unfolding before their eyes. It was the kind of forced laughter that happens when people know something is wrong but don't have the courage to intervene. What Robert didn't know was that David had spent the last 20 years trying to completely forget who he really was. 20 years since he left the world of professional boxing after an accident that changed his life forever. 20 years of keeping a secret that not even his teenage daughter knew about. 20 years of carrying a guilt that had shaped every decision, every humble job he had taken, every moment of invisibility he had embraced as penance. During those 2 decades, David had worked as a night security guard, a hospital janitor, a corporate office cleaner, always night jobs, always positions where he could remain invisible, always far from the spotlight that had once been his reality. Each night of silent work was a form of atonement, a way to pay off a debt he felt he could never fully repay. If you're enjoying this story of overcoming adversity and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple moment of prejudice would become the most humiliating lesson of Robert Johnson's life. "Come on, man," Robert continued, approaching the edge of the ring with that arrogant smile he had perfected over 3 years of intimidating newbies. His muscles rippled under the lights, every movement calculated to demonstrate physical superiority. "Just a little demonstration. I bet you don't even know how to put up a basic guard. How about you show my teammates the difference between someone who trains and someone who just cleans?" David felt that familiar sensation in his chest, like a dormant muscle being awakened after years of forced inactivity. It was the same feeling he got every time he watched the training sessions from the back of the gym, when his fighting instincts whispered technical analyses that he desperately tried to suppress. His eyes met Robert's briefly, and for a split second, something passed between them that made the fighter take an involuntary step back. Robert adjusted his boxing gloves with a theatrical gesture, clearly relishing every second of attention. It was obvious that he had turned public humiliation into a form of personal entertainment. "Everyone gather around," he announced like a master of ceremonies. "You are about to see a practical demonstration of why there is a hierarchy in the world of boxing." David watched as the 8 boxers formed a semicircle around the ring. Some seemed genuinely eager for the demonstration, fueled by the atmosphere of superiority Robert had created. Others were visibly uncomfortable, their expressions betraying an internal conflict between loyalty to the group and a basic sense of human decency. Among the spectators was Michelle Kim, a 24-year-old Asian-American sports journalist with her hair pulled back in a functional ponytail. She was at the gym researching an article on diversity in amateur boxing for Sports and Society magazine. Michelle had grown up as the daughter of Korean immigrants, facing her own challenges of acceptance in the predominantly male and white world of sports. What she was witnessing activated every social justice instinct she had developed over years of documenting systemic discrimination. "Look at them all," Robert continued, gesturing dramatically like a seasoned performer. "Here we have a perfect example of someone who never understood that there are appropriate places for certain types of people. Elite gyms like this aren't for everyone, you know." His words carried the weight of generations of exclusion, each syllable carefully chosen to establish and reinforce social hierarchies. David felt that familiar twinge in his chest, the same one he had felt 20 years ago when he heard similar comments echoing from the stands during his most important fights. The difference was that now, at 42, he had learned to transform that initial anger into something much more powerful than fists. 2 decades of forced reflection had refined his understanding of true power. "Just an educational demonstration," Robert insisted, now trying to hide the sudden uncertainty that had sprung up in his voice after that moment of eye contact. "Nothing too serious, just to show the rookies why it's important to respect the hierarchy of the sport." David picked up on the nuances in Robert's language, how he used words like respect and hierarchy to mask basic prejudice. It was the same rhetoric he'd heard from promoters, commentators, and fans throughout his career, always talking about proper place and respecting traditions when they wanted to keep certain people out. "Champion Robert," Michelle interrupted boldly, her firm voice cutting through the charged atmosphere. "Can I ask you a question? Why exactly do you think it's necessary to humiliate someone who is simply doing their job?" The silence that followed was deafening. It was as if someone had paused a movie in the middle of a climactic scene. Robert slowly turned to Michelle, his eyes narrowing with a calculated mix of surprise and irritation. He hadn't expected resistance, especially not from a young woman he had mentally categorized as a passive observer. "Excuse me, Michelle Kim," Robert said, using her full name as a clear display of authority and intimidation, "but who is conducting this training session here?" His voice carried that dangerously low tone that powerful men use when they feel challenged by someone they consider inferior in the social hierarchy. "You are," Michelle replied with a calmness that surprised even herself, "but that shouldn't include racial humiliation disguised as a technical demonstration." Her words cut through the air like a sharp blade, exposing the naked truth behind the athletic facade. Several boxers exchanged nervous glances, like animals sensing danger in the air. No one had ever confronted Robert like this before. The gym environment had always operated under an unquestioned hierarchy, where Robert's word was absolute law. Michelle's courageous intervention was revealing cracks in the system that everyone had accepted as normal. Robert felt his face flush with an explosive mixture of anger and public embarrassment. "Racial," he laughed with an exaggerated force that betrayed his defensiveness. "This has absolutely nothing to do with race. It has to do with respect for boxing and knowing your place in the natural hierarchy of the sport." David opened his eyes slowly, like a predator emerging from a deep sleep. There was something in the way Michelle spoke, the sheer courage of a young woman standing up to established authority, that reminded him painfully of his younger sister Keisha. She had that same incandescent determination, that same categorical refusal to accept injustice silently, even when protesting meant putting herself in danger. Keisha Washington had died at the age of 17, the victim of a stray bullet during a police confrontation in her neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. David was competing in Tokyo when he received the call that changed his life forever. While he was collecting world titles and belts, his little sister had been reduced to a statistic of urban violence. Another person he loved deeply, lost while he pursued glory in distant rings. One more reason to abandon everything and disappear into the anonymous simplicity of a life without the spotlight. "Michelle," Robert said in a dangerously low voice, each word laden with veiled threat, "if you can't respect my proven teaching methods, perhaps you should find another gym for your research. There are more suitable places for people with your overly sensitive mindset." The threat hung in the air like toxic smoke, heavy and suffocating. Michelle felt a chill run down her spine, not from fear, but from pure anger at the obvious attempt to silence her through intimidation. She had spent years documenting exactly this type of behavior, but witnessing it firsthand still managed to shock her. "My tuition is paid in full, champ," she replied with a firmness that surprised everyone present. "And I believe that everyone here deserves a learning environment based on genuine mutual respect, not systemic humiliation disguised as education." That's when David did something no one in the room expected. He started to smile. It wasn't a nervous or submissive smile from someone trying to defuse a tense situation. It was the slow, calculated, and slightly dangerous smile of someone who had just found a reason powerful enough to stop hiding behind a facade of invisibility. For 20 consecutive years, David had carried the crushing weight of guilt for 2 deaths that had resulted, directly or indirectly, from his involvement in the brutal and competitive world of professional fighting. Now, watching a brave young woman defend basic principles of justice and human dignity that he had abandoned decades ago, David Washington slowly began to remember who he really was before the tragedy that forced him into self-imposed exile. "Robert," David said finally, his voice laden with a quiet, unyielding authority that made everyone in the room turn instinctively toward him. It was as if the very air had changed density. "The young lady is right. This has nothing to do with boxing, technique, or sports hierarchy. It's about you trying to feel important and powerful through the systematic humiliation of other people." Robert spun on his heels like an enraged bull, his face red with explosive indignation. "How dare you lecture me about boxing?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the gym walls. "You don't even know what it's like to be in a real ring." David took a single step forward, and something fundamental changed instantly in his body language. His shoulders straightened with military authority, his center of gravity lowered imperceptibly into a fighting stance, and his feet positioned themselves in a stance that any experienced fighter would instantly recognize as technically perfect. It was like watching a metamorphic transformation, an ordinary man revealing the form of a born predator. "Actually," David said with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the commotion around him, "I know exactly what a real ring is. And I know that this place ceased to be one a long time ago, when you decided to turn it into a theater of personal humiliation." Robert felt an inexplicable primitive chill run down his spine, as if he had just awakened something that should have remained dormant. There was something about the way David moved now, the way he occupied the physical space around him, that awakened all of his basic instincts for self-preservation. But his wounded pride and inflated ego would not allow him to back down publicly. "Enough philosophical talk," Robert growled with growing desperation, assuming his favorite fighting stance, the same one he had used to intimidate hundreds of beginners over the years. "I'll teach you respect the way real men learn, through brute force." Michelle watched the scene with a fascinating mixture of journalistic apprehension and professional fascination. During 2 years of documenting the world of amateur and professional boxing for her research, she had analyzed hundreds of hours of footage of the great masters of history. Something about the way the janitor moved now reminded her vividly of the historical videos she had studied: Muhammad Ali, Sugar Ray Robinson, Floyd Patterson. The perfect economy of movement, the absolute control of his breathing, the calm presence that radiated contained and devastating power. David closed his eyes briefly and allowed 22 years of professional muscle memory to resurface like a flood. Every meticulously perfected technique, every hard-won victory, every brutal lesson learned in the most unforgiving rings around the world. When he opened them again, Robert was looking directly into the eyes of David's Silent Thunder Washington, 5-time consecutive world heavyweight boxing champion. "Robert," David offered with a kindness that somehow sounded more threatening than any shout, "last chance to sincerely apologize to Michelle for trying to silence her, apologize to your teammates for turning this sacred space of learning into a circus of personal ego, and turn this place back into what it should be, a sanctuary of mutual respect and athletic growth." The offer of clemency hung in the air thick as incense smoke, laden with possibilities and consequences. Robert could have chosen humility at that crucial moment. He could have acknowledged that he had crossed fundamental lines of human decency. He could have preserved what little dignity he had left. Instead, consumed by years of unchecked arrogance, he chose the path of violence. Robert's first punch was technically impressive, a quick, precise jab, executed exactly as he had learned in the training manuals and practiced thousands of times against punching bags and submissive sparring partners. It was the kind of devastating blow that had worked against 99% of the people he had faced during his 3-year amateur career. David Washington was not in the 99%. The movement that followed was so fast, so fluid, and so technically perfect that half of those present couldn't even fully process what had happened before their eyes. David simply wasn't where Robert's fist was aimed. His body slid to the side like crystal clear water flowing around a solid rock, an evasion so elegant that it seemed to defy the basic laws of physics. And suddenly, without any visible effort, Robert was completely off balance, his right arm stretched pathetically into the empty air, his base compromised, his guard completely open. "Nice try," David commented softly, already repositioned and perfectly balanced as if he had never moved. "Clean basic technique, adequate speed for an amateur, but you telegraphed the entire move with micro-movements in your right shoulder. Any professional would have seen that coming from a mile away. Robert spun wildly, desperately trying to locate his opponent and regain some semblance of control of the situation. How had someone moved with such supernatural speed? Beginner's luck, he muttered more to himself than to David, trying to rationalize the impossible. The second attack came in quick, furious succession. Jab, straight, left hook. 3 punches connected with the mechanical precision of someone who had practiced the combination thousands of times until it became muscle memory. It was his favorite and most reliable sequence, the one he used to finish sparring sessions and impress easily intimidated newbies. Once again, David simply wasn't there when the fists arrived. This time, Michelle managed to partially follow the movement with her trained eyes. David had ducked at an impossible angle, allowing the jab to pass over his head by inches. The straight punch found only air as he leaned into a curve that defied human anatomy. And when Robert threw his left hook with all his desperate strength, David took a microscopic step back, causing the fist to pass millimeters from his chin without even ruffling his hair. Interesting combination and technically sound, David observed with the same calmness of a teacher analyzing a math problem, still breathing with perfect regularity. It works well against static opponents or beginners, but you're leaving your left side completely exposed after the hook, and your recovery is too slow for professional competition. After completely missing his most reliable sequence, Robert was starting to sweat profusely. Beads of sweat mixed with panic ran down his forehead. This was not remotely normal. He had landed literally thousands of punches throughout his athletic career, and now he couldn't land a single blow on a man who had supposedly never fought professionally. Stop dancing like a ballerina and fight like a man. Robert shouted with growing desperation, launching an even more aggressive and uncoordinated flurry of punches. It was at that precise moment that David decided the educational demonstration had lasted long enough. Robert's third attack, a desperate and technically flawed combination of wild punches and erratic movements, found only air once again. But this time something fundamentally different happened in the spatial dynamics between them. When Robert recovered after completely missing all of his punches, David was inexplicably much closer. He hadn't witnessed any visible movement, but somehow the distance between them had evaporated like morning mist. How is this possible? Robert whispered with growing terror, realizing that he had completely lost control of the fighting distance, one of the most fundamental skills in boxing. Robert, David said softly, now positioned at exactly arm's length, do you really want to know the technical difference between someone who learned to fight in controlled gyms against cooperative partners and someone who learned through years in the most brutal professional rings in the world? Before Robert could formulate any response, David did something that completely defied everything those present thought they knew about basic physics and human combat. Without appearing to use any visible muscular force, without any sudden movements or aggressive gestures, he simply touched Robert in the center of his chest with the open palm of his right hand. Robert literally flew through the air. He wasn't gradually pushed or knocked down by brute force. He was instantly propelled backward as if struck by an invisible seismic wave. His feet left the ground completely. He traveled approximately 8 feet through the air in a perfect arc and landed on his back on the mat with an impact that made everyone in the room gasp simultaneously. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Michelle Kim stopped breathing completely. In 2 intensive years of studying combat biomechanics and analyzing the techniques of great historical masters, she had never witnessed such a controlled and simultaneously devastating display of refined technical power. There was no unnecessary brutality, no emotional rage, just the clinical and precise application of physical principles she had only seen in documented legends. What just happened to me? Robert muttered from the floor, staring at the ceiling with glassy eyes, desperately trying to process a reality that defied his comprehension. There was no significant physical pain, just the overwhelming experience of having encountered someone operating at a level of skill completely different from anything he had ever known or imagined possible. David calmly extended his hand to help Robert to his feet, a gesture of chivalry that contrasted dramatically with the display of power he had just executed. It's actually quite simple once you understand the fundamental principles of body leverage, perfect timing, and efficient transfer of kinetic energy. Concepts I've learned over a 22-year professional career at the highest level of world boxing. Robert ignored the outstretched hand and struggled to his feet, his legs still shaking like leaves in the wind. A 22-year professional career in what exactly? Michelle answered for David, her voice reduced to a reverent whisper. You really don't understand who he is, do you? Everyone turned to her, who was still holding her smartphone with the results of a quick search that had completely changed her understanding of the situation. On the small screen, dozens of historical articles, iconic photographs, and classic videos confirmed what her sports journalist instincts had already begun to suspect. David Washington, she read aloud with growing reverence, also known professionally as Silent Thunder. 5-time consecutive world heavyweight boxing champion, unanimously regarded by experts as one of the most technically refined and strategically intelligent fighters in modern history, retired undefeated after a legendary 22-year career following a tragic accident during a sparring session that resulted in the accidental death of his best friend and training partner. The devastating impact of the words hit the room like a seismic blast. Robert felt all the blood drain from his face as the full reality finally crystallized in his consciousness. He had publicly challenged and attempted to humiliate a living legend of world boxing. He had systematically provoked someone who could have hospitalized him with a casual movement, but who had chosen mercy and politeness over retribution. 3 months later, the elite boxing academy was completely transformed. David was no longer invisible as a night janitor. Michelle had used her journalistic connections to convince the gym's owner to hire him as a head instructor specializing in advanced boxing techniques and philosophy. His classes quickly became the most sought after in the city. Robert had lost most of his local sponsorships after Michelle's discreetly recorded video went viral on social media, but he found a new purpose teaching basic boxing to young people in underserved communities, with a genuine humility forged by public shame and forced self-reflection. "The most important lesson I can teach is simple and universal," David told Michelle after one of his classes on respect and humility. "Never judge someone's worth or potential based on their current profession, outward appearance, or temporary circumstances. Every human being carries stories, experiences, and capabilities that can deeply surprise us if we take the time to look beyond the surface. Sometimes justice arrives quietly, like a storm that completely transforms the landscape without making a sound." David has proven definitively that true greatness emerges from personal character and moral integrity, not from temporary titles or external recognition. If this story of transformation and poetic justice touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now to discover more inspiring narratives about how extraordinary people turn systematic humiliation into lasting triumph through dignity, preparation, and the right moment to reveal who they truly are.